Hey everyone, Carmen Rios here, digital editor at Ms., talking to Will Tamayo, who is the district director of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Thank you so much for being here with me
You're
today.
welcome. Thank you for having me.
I want to start with this article from 2005. So Will's work was featured in a depressingly contemporary and relevant 2005 issue of Ms., focusing on the egregious harassment and sexual assault that farm worker women were facing across the country. It was disturbing because in so many ways it could have been published in our most recent issue. Um, and I've talked to so many farm worker women this week about what they're facing and how they're mobilizing. Um, there was this question posed to us on day one by Sandra of what will it take to end sexual violence? And I'm curious from your perspective, what laws and policies and protections it might take to finally change that narrative and go beyond this Me Too moment of, empowering women to speak up and actually into solving the problem at the root and shifting some of those power dynamics that perpetuate, these cultures of violence and harassment?
Well, that's a great first question. So I think the Ms. Magazine article that you referred to from 2005 by Rebecca Claren was written after my office won a nearly $1 million verdict against Harris Farms, one of the largest farms in California, on behalf of Olivia Tamayo, who had been raped 3 times by a supervisor at Harris Farms. The jury came back unanimously believed that Renee Rodriguez had raped Mrs. Tamayo, and that she had been retaliated against by the company. So that was a pivotal moment, I think, for the EEOC and also for farm worker advocates to see that the government, the EEOC, could go forward and fight for farm workers. And my priority when I was regional attorney was to make sure that the EEOC, a civil rights agency, was relevant and meaningful to the most vulnerable populations. And in the jurisdiction we cover, it was farm workers. Since then, I think the questions that we've litigated many cases in my jurisdiction and all over the country for farm workers, because I think the Harris Farms case, and along with our first major case against Tanamura and Antle, which was another rape case, quid pro quo, a $1.855 million settlement against the largest lettuce grower in the world, opened the door so that farm workers could have hope. And this is consistent with what the international human rights movement has said, is that government must protect. Aside from not abusing, it must also protect. But your major question is, well, what will it change? What will change? And I think it takes a combination of things. One is, excuse me, certainly the laws have to be enforced, but the major issue we see at the EEOC is retaliation. So that women are scared, employers threaten termination, deportation, whatever, to ensure that Maria can never complain. We have to change that. And the only way I think that can change is not just enforcing the law, but those who are in charge have to finally embrace the problem. This is no different from what's been going on in Catholic churches in certain dioceses, nothing different from what was going on campuses, similar to what's going on in the military. A few years ago, I had the opportunity to speak to growers in Eastern Washington, and I wanted them to grasp this problem. So I asked them to analogize to the base commanders or the admiral who looks the other way, doesn't care about that female soldier who volunteered for her country, who may have gone to West Point or to some Annapolis, but is being sexually assaulted by soldiers under his command. And here she's done everything right, and she's being assaulted, and she can't speak out. What does he, as the leader, want to do? And I think the positive thing is the Me Too movement has put this out to the public and revealed how, from everything, from Hollywood, from news agencies to different positions, the system or people in power enable the perpetrators to do these assaults on women because they either don't speak up, they don't hold the perpetrators accountable, they feel the perpetrators too powerful or too important to the company that they can't afford to lose him. So their values are clearly profits over the needs of the workers or the safety of the workers.
Yeah. And what sort of, you've served in your current position at the EEOC since 2015, which I feel like means you started at the in women pursuing sort of filing more complaints or speaking up more in these official avenues. Have you noticed a shift since the Me Too movement sort of exploded?
Yeah, so I just want to clarify, I was the regional attorney directing the litigation from 1995 to 2015. And then 2015, I became the director overseeing everything, including the investigations and operations for the agency. So I've wanted to steer a lot of the resources consistent with my approach to underserved communities. Now, you raise the question, has there been a change? Surprisingly, we haven't seen a marked increase yet in the number of women filing with the EEOC for sexual harassment. More inquiries are coming in. However, retaliation, the claim for retaliation has steadily increased from about 25% in the last fiscal year was at 48%.
Oh, wow.
So almost half the charges have something related to retaliation. And I will tell you, we have never filed a sexual harassment case that never had a retaliation component. Mm. And women don't come, particularly farm worker women, they don't come to the EEOC complaining of sexual harassment. They complain that they were fired and they want their job back. And once we find out, well, why were you fired? Then they explain, I was protesting sexual harassment and then I got fired. Then we ask them, were there any other instances? Then they come out telling about the other assaults that were going on. So it's going to take some time.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, I think in this period, what we've also seen is because of the fear of retaliation, deportation, all these other things, in farm worker communities and other low wage communities, it hasn't seen quite the spike yet, but I think the movement of different unions, the farm worker advocates, hopefully that's going to change the tide. But, they're very scared. They're very scared in this whole issue of, people who are undocumented, they're scared. While we have some things like the U visa to help them stay, that still is a major deterrent for them to come forward.
Yeah, and I've sort of also noticed this through line of the idea that sexual harassment isn't normal, like that, that there's been a cultural shift to this notion that women shouldn't have to deal with sexual harassment in the workplace. And I'm wondering too if you feel like maybe workplaces don't do enough to educate their workers about their rights when it comes to sexual harassment, which is also something that has come up. So many victims, I think, feel helpless and powerless when they're being sexually harassed. They don't want to lose their jobs. They don't want to speak up. They want to feed their families and take care of themselves. What legal recourse do survivors of, egregious harassment and sexual assault in the workplace have? And what do you think that they should know if they're watching right now?
Well, the reason why I'm here speaking at this conference is so that they know, like, government organizations like the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission or the State Department of Fair Employment and Housing are here to investigate these cases, to file lawsuits for these women. And we've done that numerous times across the country. We don't ask immigration status. And if we're in litigation, we always fight it off to make sure that immigration status stays out of the litigation, is not an issue. Even though, employers still try to push that in litigation, but we say her immigration status is irrelevant to whether she was sexually assaulted or not. I think the other part of this discussion also talks about why, in particularly in agriculture, it's so prevalent. And we were litigating quite a few cases, and I was wondering, why is it in the 21st century we're still having this problem? And it came clear to me when I went to Thomas Jefferson's plantation. And then all the bells and whistles went off. Because this was the time when, stories were talked about Thomas Jefferson having, quote unquote, a relationship with a slave, Sally Hemings. But we know that many slave owners, plantation owners, slave overseers or plantation overseers raped Black women. and that was perfectly legal. No law was violated. So if you're a perpetrator in the 21st century, what you want to do is be a Thomas Jefferson, be a plantation owner. And so you do everything in your power to make sure that you have every weapon to ensure that Maria can never access the laws. Even though there's laws now, make sure that she could never access the laws, go to law enforcement, seek help, etc. And unfortunately, that works. That works in many parts of the industry. But ultimately, I do think it will take a movement, and I think also the sexual assault movement strongly embracing the farm workers, the janitors, the lower income workers who are often neglected in the discussions.
Yeah.
And so in the Me Too movement, we hear about the big celebrity cases, but not necessarily the other cases where women really don't have a lot of power to speak out and don't have voices. And so we're trying to make sure that they have a voice. And hopefully we can change the dialogue so that companies who employ farm workers will embrace this issue and decide that they don't want to have their workers endangered. Unfortunately, the agriculture industry still has a way to go, and it has a history of trying to fight off the laws. So for example, farm workers cannot organize under the National Labor Relations Act. There is no state that formally recognizes the rights of farm workers to unionize except California. During the 30s, when the Fair Labor Standards Act came in, the plantation lobbyists were basically trying to ensure that farm workers won't even have the minimum wage, to ensure that essentially Black labor in the South was going to be tied to the land. So that's the origins and that's the history and legacy of the Me Too movement in agriculture. And I think that's, it's important to see that's how it happens. Yeah. That we went from a period where a sexual assault on slaves was perfectly legal. There was no violation there, no law violated there, to now where the laws are there, but it's a question of whether they will have real life for farm workers.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, I think that touches on so much too that, they screened the rape of Recy Taylor the other night at the conference, and it was just so clear how, legacies of slavery and systemic racism and in that Jim Crow era in the 40s, how that shaped this entire case where people really didn't feel, that it was inappropriate that, a bunch of white boys just gang raped this Black woman and she just couldn't find justice. So I do think, and we've been having a lot of conversations about sort of untangling the white supremacy in our own movement to end violence, as well as, in the culture at large as a part of the movement to end violence. And, Me Too is also part of this much longer movement, and all of the farm worker women that I've spoken to and, many of the low-income women that I've spoken to or worked with around this conference specifically have rightfully pointed out that they've been organizing against sexual harassment and assault for decades, and we were recently at a gala honoring Maria Lana Durazo, who was pointing out that hotel workers have been organizing against sexual harassment since before the Me Too movement really exploded. And so sexual harassment isn't a new problem. It was also depressingly still relevant on the cover of Ms. in the 70s. What are some of the biggest changes, though, that you've seen over the course of your career? And what do you think are some of the sort of big things that are yet to come, but that maybe we're finally getting closer to?
Well, I think two videos that came out by Frontline. The first one, Rape in the Fields, which focused on cases that my office and other EEOC offices had done for farm workers, was pivotal in 2013 in getting farm workers to know more about their rights and getting the public to know about a major issue. And that was followed up with Rape on the Night Shift, which talked about the rape of janitors and service workers, and focused on a case that our Los Angeles EEOC office litigated against ABM. So those were major strides, and that, in fact, Rape on the Night Shift helped start a movement within the SEIU so that they would pick up the issue of sexual harassment of janitors, which is just totally great. So I think the positive thing for me is that the issue is being front and central now to the sexual assault movement. I would tell you that I spoke to very many sexual assault organizations over the years, and very few of them knew what remedies there were for workers in the workplace.
Yeah.
And it was inevitable that somebody would always come up to me and say, wow, I wish I knew about you and the EEOC and these laws 2 years ago, because somebody came to my office and I didn't know what to do. So that now that the sexual assault movement has put this front and center and has, made workplace issues a priority, that's very important. Same way as is so critical. They're having a voice in the very networks that they need to be actively part of.
Awesome. And part of your presentation today, too, is on the responsibilities that medical professionals and advocates and counselors have to victims. So in touching on the theme of the conference, which is bold moves, what bold moves do you think that those folks need to take for victims to both support them and then also maybe, have a reverberating impact that sort of shifts the culture?
Well, I can answer that with a big illustration of a case we litigated in Oregon against Willamette Tree Wholesale on the case of Emiteria Bustos, who had been raped multiple times by a supervisor. And after each rape, he would tell her, if you tell anybody, I will kill you and your siblings who work here at the farm. So she never told a soul. And eventually we got the case because her sister had been sexually harassed and was fired, sought help at the Oregon Law Center. And she eventually tells the Oregon Law Center, well, my sister had been fired over a year ago. So we were contacted about it. I was contacted. I flew up to Portland. We interviewed her, and we find out that she was 62 days late to file her charge with the EEOC because she held this in for a year. She never told a soul. And so what we did was we said, we're going to take this charge and we're going to fight it out. We know the company will say, she's too late. She can't file a charge. But I said, we're going to take the charge, and we argued to the court that the company cannot benefit from having traumatized and intimidated Emiteria so much that she could not come forward.
Yeah.
And we relied on a psychologist, Dr. Fabiana Wallace, and a therapist, Jessica Trednick, to work with Emiteria to produce a report for the judge that talked about how traumatized she was. And Judge Papik, reviewing that report, agreed with us that this was a situation that called for what the court says is equitable tolling, which is giving her more time to file her charge. It's a major victory.
Yeah.
It's a major victory.
And those sorts of things hold so many women back.
But we were fortunate. We had a bilingual psychologist who was, not just linguistically competent, but also culturally competent. And what we lack in our array of folks are people who are linguistically and culturally competent to work with low-wage workers and immigrant workers in particular. But I think you don't necessarily have to always be linguistically competent, but just be aware and know how to work with these populations. Because if they can't go someplace initially, just even to get help, and then eventually we're going to need those professionals to sometimes testify in court about what is it that the experience that Maria had that justifies her claim for emotional distress damages. And that's part of our, this is all part of a movement of trying to get so that women really have their day in court and can get some justice.
Yeah, totally. And sort of my last question for you is the question that I've been closing all my interviews with this question of what is your next bold move? What are you going to try to do moving forward at the EEOC after the conference, and just continuing on all this amazing work that you've done to try to make the EEOC a really supportive place for survivors of sexual harassment and assault?
Well, I think to some extent, I think the EEOC has been ahead of the curve here. We had a select task force look at sexual harassment and why training is not that effective. They issued a report in 2016 that said you have to have a totally new approach where employers really embrace this as their problem, because other training doesn't lead to anything. It's not changing the workplace. And so we've been really pushing to have companies change while at the same time consistently reaching out to underserved communities. I know that there's high turnover in sexual assault programs and the staffing, because the work, the salaries, the work, the demands, it's hard to stay in that work. And I also know there's high turnover in the agricultural and janitorial communities. So we have to, in fact, I would say, increase and accentuate our outreach to vulnerable communities. They need to know that we're still here despite what they may be hearing in the public. The government is here to help them pursue these claims. This is a major priority for the EEOC. It is like the top priority for us to take care of this issue.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
talking to me today and for everything you're doing.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you so much.
All right, you're welcome. Thank you.